Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I have used this leftover fabric, which was originally from a pillowcase, to create a Milkmaid top with a lace-up back. I have seen tops like this all over the place for a while now, and I thought it would be fun to try and make my own. This top was quite easy to make and would be a great project for an experienced beginner. So let's get into it. First, to make this top, I needed to take some measurements. The first measurement was across my chest. This measurement was 14 inches, including an inch for seam allowance. The second measurement was how long I wanted the top section of my top to be. This was 7 inches, including an inch for seam allowance. Next, I measured around my body where I wanted the top of the band piece to sit. As I wanted my top to have a lace-up back, I left a gap while measuring my body. My measurement was 30 inches, again including an inch for seam allowance. The last measurement I needed was how long I wanted the band piece to be. This was 6 inches, including an inch for seam allowance. Here are my measurements drawn out for you to use as a reference. The front piece length is my first measurement multiplied by 2, as this will be gathered to give the top the Milkmaid look. I started by measuring out my front piece, which was 28 inches long and 6 inches wide. Once I'd measured this, I cut it out. This is how it looked. Next, I measured out the band piece. This was 30 inches long and 7 inches wide. I then cut this out. I then marked this with a B so I knew it was the band piece. Going back to my front piece that I had marked with an F, I first needed to gather the bottom edge. I did this by sewing a basting stitch half an inch from the bottom edge. A basting stitch is a long straight stitch used to temporarily hold fabric together. I changed my stitch setting on my sewing machine to the longest straight stitch, and while sewing I made sure I didn't backstitch at the beginning or end. Once sewn, I had 2 long threads on each end of my fabric. When I pulled on the back thread, it began to gather the fabric. I did this until the fabric was 14 inches long, which was the first measurement I took. Once I was happy with this, I tied the threads on each end together and cut off any excess. This is what I had so far. Next, I moved on to the band piece. The first thing I did was hem the sides and bottom edge using a double hem. To do a double hem, I folded the edge of the fabric over 1/4 of an inch, then folded it over 1/4 of an inch again, and pinned it in place. I decided to do a double hem as it would hide the raw edges of the fabric and stop them from fraying. I did this along both sides and the bottom edge. Once everything was pinned in place, I sewed where I'd pinned, using a straight stitch and 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, remembering to change the stitch length back to the usual one I use. This is how it looked once it was sewn. I could now attach the front piece to the band piece. I started by folding the band piece in half to find the midpoint and marked this with a pin. Once I'd done that, I unfolded the band piece, and here you can see the pin has marked the midpoint. Next, I folded the front piece in half to find the midpoint and placed the midpoint of the front piece onto the midpoint of the band piece, with the gathered edge of the front piece lining up with the top edge of the band piece, making sure these pieces are right sides together. I then pin these 2 pieces together along the top edge. You should have something like this. Once it was pinned in place, I sewed where I had pinned, using a straight stitch and a 1/2 inch seam allowance. This is how it looked once it was sewn. I turned this over so the right side of the fabric was facing up, and top stitch along here where the front piece and band piece joined. While top stitching, I also hemmed the sides of the top edge of the band by folding these over 1/2 inch to match the rest of the top. I sewed 1/4 of an inch away from the join. This is how it looked. Next, I hemmed the top edge of the front piece. This will also be used as a tunnel to feed elastic through to create the gathered look on the top edge. I folded the top edge over 1/2 inch and pinned this in place. I then sewed where I'd pinned, using a straight stitch and a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This is how it looked, and as you can see here, both ends of this are open to be used as a tunnel for the elastic. Moving on to the elastic, I cut a piece that was 13 inches long. Your piece of elastic should be 1 inch shorter than the length of your top piece. I then attached a safety pin to one end of the elastic and fed it through the tunnel I had just made, and secured both ends with pins to have something like this. I then sewed where I'd pinned using a straight stitch. This is how the top looked so far. I could now make the loops for the lace-up back. First, I measured a piece of fabric that was 16 inches long and 1.5 inches wide. I turned this over so the right side of the fabric was facing up. I then folded this in half, right sides together, and pinned along the long open edge. I then sewed where I'd pinned using a straight stitch and a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once sewn, I turned this inside out so it would be the right way round. I used a safety pin to help me do this. This is how it looked. Next, I cut this piece into 8 2-inch long pieces, which will be used to make the loops for the back of my top. I then needed to attach these pieces to my top. With the wrong side of the top facing up, I took one of these pieces and folded it in half to make a loop. I then pinned the open end to the top corner of the back piece. I then repeated this until I had a loop on both corners and 2 in the middle on both sides. Like this. I then sewed these in place using a straight stitch. This is how they looked once they were sewn. Next, I made the long tie for the lace-up back. For this, I cut out a piece of fabric that was 60 inches long and 2 inches wide. There isn't a specific measurement for this, just make sure it would be long enough to tie up at the back. Taking this piece of fabric, I folded it in half, right sides together, and pinned along the open edge. I then sewed where I'd pinned using a straight stitch and a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once sewn, I turned this inside out so it would be the right way round. Again, I used a safety pin to do this. This is how it looked. I could then lace this through the loops on the back of my top. Starting at the bottom, I went up to the loop on the opposite side to the previous one, and once I got to the top, I repeated this coming down again, creating a crossover look. It might sound a bit confusing, but I hope it makes sense watching it. This is how it looked. The final thing I needed to do was make the straps. For the straps, I cut out 2 pieces of fabric that were 20 inches long and 1 inch wide. These straps can be as long or as short as you want them to be. Just make sure they are long enough to tie around the back of your neck. I folded these in half, right sides together, and pinned along the long open edge, so I had something like this. I then sewed where I'd pinned using a straight stitch and a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Again, once sewn, I turned these inside out so they would be the right way round, using a safety pin to help me do this. I could now attach the straps to the top. Taking one strap, I placed one end of it behind one of the top corners of the top and pinned this in place. I then repeated this for the second strap with the other corner of the top. When both straps were pinned in place, I sewed where I'd pinned, using a straight stitch. Once the straps were sewn on, the top was complete and this is how it looked. I was so happy with the finished top and how it fitted. This is once again a perfect top for summer and can be dressed up or dressed down, meaning it can be worn for many different occasions. I really like the lace up back and it makes it a bit different from some of the other Milkmaid tops I have seen. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, comment and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.